Hi everybody. We are going to be learning about the triangle trade system that existed at this time in United States history, and we're also going to be investigating and learning about what the Middle Passage was and the incredibly negative impact that it had within the colonies, but even more specifically upon the lives of those that were kidnapped and forced into slavery out of Africa. So we're going to begin by looking at a slide that helps us understand the triangle trade system, and then we will shift our focus over to the Middle Passage and the impact of the slave trade system that existed. So there is a lot of information on this slide. So as we look at this, I hope that we can first look down at this legend. The blue trading routes are those trading lanes or those trading routes that the American colonies controlled and had a lot of influence in. So we can see here at the top that the American colonies would be exporting or sending out tobacco, indigo, which is a plant that when used within fabric production can make fabric a shade of blue. The export or the sending out of flour and lumber, which is wood. And so the American colonies would be sending this out, and Great Britain would be sending and selling back manufactured goods. Manufactured goods can be anything from furniture from within a home to boats to mirrors to those things needed in construction for a home. Manufactured goods would take things like lumber, as we probably have talked about in our earlier lessons, and it would take lumber and make it into something else, whether it be a couch for a home, or it would then be milled into planks that could be used in the building of homes or for roofs or anything of that matter. So we see the selling from the colonies and the selling from Great Britain. But we have to remember that these are what are called raw materials. These are goods that would be usually made into other things, into manufactured goods. The British then would use these goods or these items, with the exception of tobacco, make a manufactured good and then sell it back to the colonies at a much higher cost. Then we see these different trading avenues that exist between North America, Great Britain, and Africa. Now we see there is some trade between North America and the Caribbean, but I want to focus what happens in 1619. In 1619, we have the first documentation of a slave ship bringing kidnapped Africans and forcing them into slavery within the American colonies. So we do see that right here, that slaves will be being brought in from Africa in 1619. This was an absolutely horrible and negative part of world and United States history. That Africans, men, women, and children will be kidnapped, forced into slave ships, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and then forced into slavery and a very, very strict labor system within the American or the British colonies at this point. We can see that the British, with this connection right here, will actually be paying and offering in exchange for slaves rum and manufactured goods. And then there will be the kidnapping and capturing of African men, women, and children forced onto slave ships and then sent to the British colonies within North America. But we also see a large amount of slaves being captured and kidnapped and forced into slavery within the Caribbean as well. It's very important for me to also mention that while you haven't learned about it yet, but you will within your world history class, there will be a large amount of slaves from Africa that will be kidnapped and captured and transported to South America as well. This is an incredibly negative time in the United States and world history. And so when we talk about the triangle trade, we are going to be looking at the triangle of trade that is created between North America, Great Britain, and Africa. So we see this triangle right here, and that is the system of triangle trade. The sad and negative part of the triangle trade system is that it involves the capturing and kidnapping and transportation of slaves. So as I mentioned, the very first slave ship is documented as landing within the Virginia colony in 1619. So we can see that there are raw materials such as tobacco, indigo, flour, and lumber that are being exported or sent out of the British colonies. Manufactured goods will be brought into the British colonies. But we also see that African slaves will be kidnapped and forced into forced labor within those British colonies at this period as well. It's an incredibly sad and negative time in United States and world history. So this is actually one of the most famous art depictions of a slave trade ship. You can see here what one of the levels, and I say levels on purpose, there were multiple levels of slaves that were forced to lay down throughout the entire voyage from Africa to North America or to the Caribbean or to South America. This was an incredibly horrible practice that existed. So we see here just one of the levels where we see that the slaves would be forced to lay on their backs. Oftentimes they would have what are like handcuffs that would connect them from wrist to wrist, and sometimes even from ankle to ankle, so that it would not allow for them to move during the transportation of these slaves across the Atlantic. It is horrible to think that human beings would be treated this way. We also see what is known as a cross-section drawing right here, where we see the different levels of slaves. So we see that there is a level of captured Africans, and right here where they are forced to lay down and were bound to each other. Another level here, and other levels of slaves here. We know from the journals of the slave traders, but also of those Africans that were kidnapped and forced into slavery, that oftentimes the slaves were fed twice a day, and they were often forced to go to the top of the ship to get fresh air. The reason for this is that the conditions on this and these slave ships were horrible. This was incredibly dirty, full of bacteria, and very unhygienic. Oftentimes, these captured and kidnapped Africans were not allowed to move. Little known, they were not allowed to go and use the restroom for whatever reason, and there was a lot of human waste and disease that existed within these slave ships. So we will actually see a large amount of slaves that will actually die on the forced slave ship transport, even before the slave ship would reach its end location. So we just see that there are so many people that are forced onto this ship, and how horrible of a practice that this is. This graphic gives us an idea of about how many kidnapped and captured Africans would be forced into slavery. So as we look over here, we see the number of slaves that would be forced out of Africa for a 25-year period. So we know that the very first slave ship arrived in the British colonies in 1619. So at about this point, there were some slave ships, and there was slave capturing happening before, but those slaves were being forced into different areas with the European explorers and colonizers. So we know that it is from this point on that there will be slavery within what we know as the United States area. So we see the number of slaves being kidnapped and forced into slave labor increase dramatically after 1619, to where from the years of 1776 to 1800, we see over 2 million individuals from Africa being kidnapped and forced into slavery in this 25-year period. Now, it's important to remember kind of on the timeline of things that this 25-year interval is also the time period that you will learn later about when the United States is involved in both the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution for the United States. So slavery, sadly, has an incredibly interwoven impact within the British colonies and the United States up through the Civil War. We can see here the dramatic drop in the number of kidnapped and captured Africans forced into slavery in this period, because we will see the passage of the 13th Amendment that will ban and prohibit slavery from being practiced within the United States. This is a table that is showing the slave population and the percentage of the total population within the original 13 colonies in 1770. So I know that this is jumping us a little bit ahead from the time period in which we were looking. But in 1770, this is just 6 years before the Declaration of Independence. There is a common misunderstanding that slavery did not exist in some of the original 13 colonies. This graph, as well as detailed reports, show that sadly and unfortunately, there were slave populations in every original colony within the United States. Now, we see here in New Hampshire that there were a total of 654 slaves in 1770, and we see in Virginia that there were 187,600 slaves. So this column gives us the total slave population in 1770. This column will give us the percentage of the population of that colony that is made up of slaves. So we can see that 1% of New Hampshire, of the New Hampshire colony's population, 1% is slaves. Whereas if we go down to South Carolina, 61% of South Carolina's population is made up of slaves. And it is going to show this horrible practice of prohibiting individuals within these colonies' freedom and access to basic human rights. So 61% of all of the people within South Carolina will be slaves, African slaves, and there will be a population of Native American slaves as well. This is an incredibly sad but important statistic to learn about the unfortunate practice of slavery within the British colonies and the early United States. So this table, I know that the resolution is not the best, but what this table shows us is the deaths of slaves during the coasting period and the Middle Passage on the same voyages from 1701 to 1852. So the coasting period was this time in which those slave ships would be at the port and having the slave capturers, the slave kidnappers, forcing the African individuals onto those slave ships. So there were times there were 71 slave ships where there were no deaths during the coasting period. However, mean deaths during the Middle Passage, and mean means average in this case, there were an average of 11 deaths on the slave ship during that transportation of kidnapped and captured African slaves from Africa to the Americas. So during those times in which no individuals or kidnapped and captured slaves died during the coasting period, there were about 11 slaves that died during that journey. However, we can look down here that there were 73 slave ship voyages where 40 or more kidnapped and captured African individuals will die while the slave ship is in the coasting period, in addition to 39 on average of these individuals will die during the sea voyage from Africa to the Americas. This is an incredibly sad and negative amount of death. We see that in this period of 1701 to 1852 that there are over 429 slave ship voyages that will force captured and kidnapped African slaves into an inhumane and horrible system of slavery. We see an incredible amount of death that will occur during the coasting period, and we also see an incredibly sad amount of death that will happen during the actual travels of the slave ship. It's also important to remember that this does not include the data from the earlier slave ships. As we've mentioned, the very first ship containing captured and kidnapped African slaves first arrives within the British colonies in 1619. So we know that there are more voyages that occurred from 1619 to 1701. It's just a horrible fact about this time in United States history that will have a very negative impact within the British colonies and the United States. Now, this last table looks at the death rate or the average loss rates of slaves by age. So for every 100 slaves in these age groups, and during this time period, this is the average number that will die just in the sea transport of the kidnapped and captured African individuals that would be forced into slavery. So from 1651 to 1675, historians have been able to find one voyage that had data that showed that 57 out of 100 adults died during the sailing of this slave ship from Africa to the Americas. 44 out of 100 children died. In the period from 1676 to 1700, there were 5 slave ship logs that they could find where there was an average of 7.8 adult African slaves that died, and there was an average of 7.6 African slave children that died. Now, we can look through this data, and one of the first things that should come to your awareness is that this does not take into account every single slave ship. We don't have that data. This only accounts for 199 of the slave ship voyages, where we know that when looking at this table was able to find data for about 429 different slave ship voyages. There's a lot of data missing. The numbers very likely would make the average rate of death much worse. We see here in that one time period that we examined on the other table, from 1776 to 1800, the adult death rate on average was 4.6, or about 5 kidnapped and captured African individuals that would be forced into slavery would die, and 4.8 children that would be forced into slavery would also die. This is a very sad part of world history, of United States history, but also of human history. The system of slavery is a horrible practice, and it will take the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment to finally end this system and institution of slavery being practiced within the United States. I hope that this video gives you a better understanding of the triangle trade and helps you better understand the slaves trade system and the impact of the Middle Passage on the British colonies, but also remember the horrific impact that it had on the lives of African individuals that would be kidnapped, captured, and forced into slavery.